Atlantis. Atlantis supposedly commanded an empire greater than anything early Greece had known. Then the sea erased it in one day and one night. Every clue, however, leads back to a single storyteller. It is the most famous lost civilization in human history. We all know the image, an island superpower of impossible wealth and advanced technology. Its capital was built on perfect concentric rings of land and water. Its heart was crowned by a massive temple to the sea god Poseidon, its walls gleaming with a mysterious red-gold metal called orichalcum. But as its power grew, so did its arrogance. Atlantis became an empire of hubris, marching out to conquer the world. And so, the gods intervened. The earth shook, the ocean opened, and the greatest civilization on earth was swallowed into the dark. For more than 2,000 years, explorers, pseudo-archaeologists, and mystics have scoured the globe trying to find it. If you look at a map of modern claims, Atlantis is everywhere. Some say it lies beneath the turquoise waters of the Bahamas. Others claim it is buried under the ice of Antarctica, or hidden in the sweeping geological rings of the Richat structure in the Sahara Desert. But archaeology has never found a single ruined wall, a single sunken shield, or a single sunken coin belonging to a Bronze Age superpower called Atlantis. There is no physical evidence because, unlike the Minoans or the Indus Valley, Atlantis does not begin in the dirt. It begins in the text. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. He is the sole absolute originator of the Atlantis story. There are no older Egyptian records of it. There are no earlier Greek poems about it. Plato crafted the tale as a political allegory, a philosophical thought experiment contrasting the greedy, imperialistic Atlantis with his idealized vision of ancient Athens. He may have drawn loose inspiration from real historical traumas, perhaps the catastrophic volcanic destruction of the Minoans, or the Greek city of Helike, which had recently slipped into the sea following an earthquake. But Plato was writing a moral warning, not a history textbook. The true narrative turn of Atlantis is not that it vanished. It is that we refuse to let it go. The obsession with turning a philosopher's allegory into literal map coordinates is a profoundly modern condition. Why do we need Atlantis to be real? Perhaps it is because the story taps into our deepest, most terrifying psychological fear. We look around at our own towering cities, our own advanced technologies, and our own global empires, and we realize how fragile it all is. Atlantis is the ultimate mirror. It tells us that no matter how great we become, the water always wins. Atlantis does not need to be physically real to be immortal. Real stone cities crumble. Real languages are forgotten. But the warning of Atlantis has survived for over 2 millennia. It is the greatest lost civilization in history, not because it existed, but because it is exactly what we fear to become. Göbekli Tepe. 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid, hunter-gatherers were already moving pillars weighing many tons. To understand Göbekli Tepe, you have to completely break your sense of time. Cleopatra lived closer to the invention of the iPhone than she did to the builders of this monument. Sitting on a dry limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe dates back over 11,000 years. This is the pre-pottery Neolithic period, the dawn of the human story. Before this site was discovered, the rules of history were written in a straight, logical line. First, humanity invented agriculture. Then, we settled into villages. Villages grew into cities. And finally, with the excess wealth of the city, we invented monumental religion and built towering temples. Göbekli Tepe proved that sequence completely wrong. The people who carved these stones were not farmers. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They possessed no written language. They had no beasts of burden. They had not yet invented the wheel, and they had no metal tools. Yet they converged on this hilltop and achieved the impossible. Using nothing but ropes, muscle, and sharpened flint, they carved massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons. They hauled them up the ridge and arranged them into sweeping circular enclosures. Look closely at the stones, and you will not find peaceful images of domestic life. The pillars are crawling with apex predators, boars with bared tusks, leaping foxes, spiders, and vultures holding human heads. It is a primordial, terrifying vision of the spiritual world. How did wandering bands of nomads organize the massive labor force required to build this? And more importantly, how did they feed them? Many archaeologists now believe Göbekli Tepe triggered a historical chain reaction. To sustain the hundreds of laborers working on this monumental site, humanity had to figure out how to produce a massive, reliable food supply on demand. In other words, the city did not invent the temple. The temple forced the invention of the city. But just as shocking as its creation is its end. After using the site for a millennium, the builders did not let it slowly decay. They deliberately buried it. In an act of monumental, back-breaking labor, they filled the towering stone circles with thousands of tons of dirt and rubble. They hid their masterpiece from the world and walked away. History is not a slow, predictable march of progress. It is a series of explosive, baffling leaps. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had no writing, no wheels, no metal. But they had gods, and gods required monuments. Göbekli Tepe is a real place that feels like a myth, but the greatest vanished civilization of all is a myth that humanity has spent 2,000 years trying to turn into reality. The Indus Valley Civilization. Millions may have lived inside the Indus world, yet no king, war, or prayer from that civilization can be read today. 4,500 years ago, spanning across modern-day Pakistan and northwestern India, the Harappan civilization built a world defined by absolute, almost chilling perfection. If you were to walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro or Dholavira, you would not find the chaotic, winding dirt paths of a primitive village. You would find cities laid out on mathematically precise grid systems. You would find standardized baked bricks. You would find complex, covered sewage networks and flush toilets that rivaled modern plumbing. It was a vast, hyper-organized urban society. But what is truly haunting about the Indus Valley is not what is there. It is what is missing. Look at contemporary Egypt, or Sumer, and you will find colossal statues of egomaniacal pharaohs, murals of bloody conquests, and temples demanding submission to the gods. In the Indus cities, archaeologists have found none of this. No obvious royal palaces, no monumental war art, no grand tombs filled with slaughtered servants. This absence has fueled a massive, provocative question. Did the Indus people achieve a peaceful, egalitarian utopia? Or was their hierarchy simply enforced in ways our modern eyes cannot see, perhaps through strict purity rituals centered around massive public waterworks like the Great Bath? We should be able to ask them, because they did leave writing. Across the ruins, excavators have uncovered thousands of beautifully carved steatite seals. They are stamped with images of elephants, tigers, and a mysterious single-horned creature known as the unicorn. Above these animals runs a line of elegant geometric symbols. But this is where the Indus Valley becomes the ultimate locked-room mystery of the ancient world. Despite over a century of effort, the application of supercomputers, and the dedication of the world's greatest linguists, the Indus script remains completely unbroken. The tragic reality is a matter of data. There is no bilingual Rosetta Stone to translate their words into a known language, and the inscriptions they left behind are agonizingly short, averaging just 5 symbols each. We do not know if these seals are merchant receipts, magical amulets, or family names. Because we cannot read a single syllable, everything about their identity is a projection of our own modern imagination. Mohenjo-Daro is just a modern name meaning Mound of the Dead. We have no idea what the people who walked those perfectly straight streets actually called their city. The Indus Valley is the ultimate ghost state. We know exactly how they engineered their sewers, and we know exactly how much their market weights weighed. But we do not know the names of their kings, the names of their gods, or the name of the civilization itself. The Indus Valley built perfect cities that we still cannot fully understand. But thousands of years earlier, deep in the hills of ancient Anatolia, humanity built something that breaks the rules of history entirely. They were people who shouldn't have been able to build anything, and yet they left behind a monument that changed the world. Sanxingdui and Ancient Shu. In 1986, archaeologists opened 2 pits in China and found bronze faces unlike anything in Chinese history. For decades, the story of early China was relatively neat. Civilization, it was taught, radiated outward from a single center along the Yellow River. But when workers digging clay in the southwestern province of Sichuan broke through the earth, that neat historical timeline was shattered forever. Beneath the soil lay the ruins of Sanxingdui, a culture dating back over 3,000 years, closely tied to the lost ancient Shu kingdom. And what they left behind is so visually shocking that it continues to baffle researchers today. The pits were filled with giant bronze masks, but they do not look human. They feature mouths stretching ear to ear, massive flared ears that sweep back like wings, and, most unsettling of all, enormous cylindrical eyes projecting out from the face. The largest of these masks spans over a meter wide. To a modern viewer, they look less like ancient royal portraits and more like visitors from another world. And the faces were not alone. Beside them lay hundreds of elephant tusks, a staggering amount of gold foil, and a monumental bronze spirit tree standing nearly 4 meters tall, its branches holding metallic birds. But the strangest detail of Sanxingdui is how these objects ended up in the dirt. They were not lost in a war, nor were they carefully arranged in the tomb of a dead king. They were ritually murdered. Before being buried, these priceless masterpieces were deliberately smashed, broken, and burned. Imagine the scene: a civilization at its peak. Shamans, perhaps wearing these heavy bronze masks, moving through thick smoke to systematically destroy their society's most magnificent wealth before plunging it into the earth. Why did they break their gods and walk away? We don't know. Like the Oxus and the Liangzhu, the people of Sanxingdui left behind no written records. Because the artifacts look so impossible, popular theories frequently claim these faces must be evidence of extraterrestrial contact. But archaeology tells a story that is much more profound. The metal is completely of this earth. Analysis proves these are the work of human craftsmen who possessed an absolute genius-level command of bronze casting. What is alien is not the creators, it is their imagination. These masks were likely meant to represent deities or ancestors whose bulging eyes allowed them to see across spiritual dimensions. Sanxingdui proves that human history does not follow a single, predictable script. The faces are entirely human-made, but the civilization's mind remains thrillingly, terrifyingly unfamiliar. Sanxingdui left behind impossible faces, but no words. It is a mystery of extreme, chaotic ritual. But to the west, what happens when an entire civilization builds a perfectly ordered, mathematically precise world, and then goes utterly silent? The Minoans. The Minoans ruled the Aegean, built palaces without defensive walls, and wrote in a language no one can read. Then their world changed forever. 4,000 years ago, the island of Crete was the center of a maritime superpower. While other Bronze Age empires were fortifying massive citadels against constant warfare, the Minoans built Knossos. It was a sprawling, utopian labyrinth of multi-story architecture, flushed toilets, and sweeping courtyards. Their walls were not built for defense. They were painted with vibrant frescoes of dolphins, griffins, and athletes leaping over the horns of charging bulls. They felt entirely safe. Their empire was the ocean itself. But around 1600 BCE, the ocean betrayed them. Just north of Crete, the volcanic island of Thera detonated. It was one of the most violent geological events in recorded human history. A column of ash and rock blasted 40 kilometers into the stratosphere. The center of the island completely collapsed into the sea, triggering a towering tsunami that raced across the Aegean. The waves slammed into the northern coast of Crete. They completely decapitated the Minoan trading fleet, drowning their ports and flooding their agricultural heartland with salt and pumice. For a long time, the popular story was that the Minoans were simply erased in a single afternoon. A beautiful, peaceful society wiped off the map by the wrath of the earth. But archaeology has revealed a much darker, slower narrative turn. The volcano did not kill them all instantly. The Minoans survived the ash and the waves. They cleared the rubble. They tried to rebuild. But the environmental shock was fatal. Their economy was crippled, their ships were gone, and the absolute authority of their rulers had been shattered by the gods. Fatally weakened, they limped on for a few more generations, only to be violently conquered by the warlike Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland. The disaster was not a sudden erasure, it was the bleeding out of a golden age. But the trauma of that bleeding never truly vanished. The terrifying memory of a highly advanced island empire suddenly punished by the earth and swallowed by the sea echoed down through centuries of Mediterranean storytelling. Many researchers now ask, was the catastrophic destruction of the Minoans the true historical seed that would eventually blossom into the myth of Atlantis? We may never know for certain, because the Minoans cannot speak for themselves. We have thousands of their administrative texts, written in an elegant script known as Linear A. But despite decades of effort, the language remains entirely unread. The Minoan world is a locked room. We can walk through their ruined palaces. We can stare at the vibrant bulls painted on their walls. But we cannot hear their voices. The Minoans lost their language to time, leaving us to guess at the meaning of their art. But deep in the soil of southwestern China, an entirely different civilization left behind faces so shocking, they seem to belong to another world entirely. Ancient Dwarka. Indian tradition says Krishna's city disappeared beneath the sea. Archaeologists have now found ancient remains there, but not the answer everyone wants. In the ancient verses of the Mahabharata, the story is apocalyptic. The divine hero Krishna built a magnificent capital on the western coast of India, a utopian city glittering with gold, silver, and precious stones. But when Krishna departed from the mortal world, the ocean rose up. In a single, devastating day, the golden city of Dwarka was swallowed entirely by the Arabian Sea. For centuries, it was read as sacred mythology, a story of divine architecture and ultimate impermanence. Then, the divers went down. Off the modern coast of Gujarat, in the exact, treacherous, tide-heavy waters named by the ancient texts, marine archaeologists began to scour the seabed. And they found ruins. Through the murky, swirling currents, divers discovered the undeniable footprints of a sunken world. Massive stone foundations, the remains of defensive walls, scattered pottery, and most striking of all, enormous triangular stone anchors with holes cut through them, the unmistakable signature of a sprawling, ancient maritime port. There really was a city here, and the sea really did swallow it. But when science and sacred geography collide, the truth is rarely simple. When researchers attempted to date the ruins, the mystery only deepened. Some artifacts point to a thriving port dating back to around 1500 BCE, though dates remain fiercely debated. But this chronology does not perfectly align with the orthodox religious timelines of the epic, which often place the events much further back in the mists of time. Furthermore, the divers did not find palaces of gold. they found heavy, pragmatic stone. The bones of a bustling, incredibly wealthy trade hub that was slowly devoured by rising sea levels or sudden coastal flooding. Did the discovery validate the literal existence of a god's capital? Or did a catastrophic prehistoric flood terrify the local survivors so deeply that it inspired a millennium of storytelling? Dwarka sits perfectly on the knife edge between faith and forensics. The physical reality is that the ocean off the coast of India claimed an ancient harbor. But the emotional reality is far more powerful. The sea swallowed a city of stone, but the human imagination turned it into a city of gold. The disaster birthed a legend that outlived the ruins themselves. Dwarka is a legend looking for a ruin. But across the world, in the heart of the Mediterranean, there is a very real ruin, and its catastrophic end may have birthed the greatest legend of all time. Cucuteni, Trypillia, Megasites. Europe's first giant settlements did not simply fall into ruin. Their houses repeatedly burned, and the people moved on. Long before the first stones of Stonehenge were moved, and before the Sumerians built their first ziggurats, an astonishing network of megasites stretched across the plains of modern-day Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. From roughly 5,400 to 2,700 BCE, the Cucuteni Trypillia culture accomplished something that defies logic. They built enormous settlements, massive concentric circles of houses spanning hundreds of hectares, holding upwards of 10,000 people at a time. They were cities before cities were supposed to exist. Yet there are no royal palaces here, no monumental temples, just an endless, dizzying maze of beautifully crafted homes filled with brilliantly painted, swirling pottery. But everywhere archaeologists dig, they find the exact same terrifying footprint: a thick, uniform layer of intensely baked clay and ash. For decades, the historical assumption was straightforward and tragic. These megasites must have been victims of war. Marauding tribes sweeping across the prehistoric steppes, setting fire to the villages and slaughtering the inhabitants. But when forensic archaeologists looked closer, the story completely inverted. Experimental archaeology proved that an accidental brush fire, or a quick torch thrown by an enemy, could not bake clay walls into the rock-hard rubble found at these sites. These ruins were subjected to staggering, prolonged heat, reaching temperatures up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. These fires were not accidents. They were engineered. Every 60 to 80 years, it appears the inhabitants of these cities deliberately packed their own homes with wood, brush, and fuel. Imagine the psychological weight of this event. An entire community, numbering in the thousands, standing in the darkness. They strike the flint, they step back, and they watch the homes of their ancestors, their beautifully painted bowls, and their entire physical history become a roaring, blinding inferno. When the embers cooled, they either rebuilt directly on top of the ashes, or they simply walked away, moving across the plains to start the cycle all over again. Why? Was it a massive ritual of purification? The deliberate death and rebirth of the city itself? Or an extreme method of prehistoric sanitation? The exact reason is lost to the flames. But it leaves us with a haunting realization. The strangest thing about Europe's first massive cities isn't how big they were. It's that the people who built them believed that nothing, not even their own masterpiece, was meant to last forever. For the builders of prehistoric Europe, destruction was a choice. But thousands of miles to the east, destruction came from the sea. And what the ocean swallowed, it eventually turned into a god. Caral Supe. While Egypt was raising pyramids, another civilization was building monumental cities on the opposite side of the world. Welcome to the Supe Valley of Peru. Here, 5,000 years ago, trapped between the towering Andes and the Pacific Ocean, humanity did something extraordinary. In a landscape that looks like the surface of Mars, an entirely independent world was being born. When archaeologists carbon dated the ruins of the sacred city of Caral, the results sent a shockwave through the historical timeline. These structures were built around 3000 BCE. This makes Caral the oldest known civilization in the Americas, flourishing at the exact same time as the early pharaohs of Egypt and the city-states of Sumer. But what they achieved is not just a triumph of timing, it is a triumph of isolation. The builders of Caral had no contact with the outside world. They had no beasts of burden. They had no metal tools to cut stone, and they had not yet invented the wheel. Yet they built an empire of stone. If you stood in the center of Caral at its height, you would not see a primitive village. You would see sprawling, flat-topped, terraced pyramids rising against the barren mountains. You would see thousands of people descending into massive, sunken, circular plazas. Imagine standing in the pit of a stone amphitheater at night, enveloped in firelight and shadow, listening to the haunting melodies of flutes carved from the bones of pelicans and condors. Caral forces us to ask a profound question about human nature. How is it that two totally disconnected populations, separated by vast oceans, both decided to drag thousands of tons of rock into the desert to build massive mountains reaching toward the sky? These were not exact copies of Egyptian pyramids. They were stepped platform mounds designed to elevate the living rather than entomb the dead. To protect them from the region's violent earthquakes, the architects filled the foundations with shikra, woven reed bags packed with stones that absorb seismic shocks. It was a masterpiece of indigenous engineering. And strangest of all, they did it without war. Unlike the heavily fortified citadels of the ancient world, excavators at Caral have found almost no weapons of war, no defensive walls, no evidence of violent conquest. Instead, this was a society bound together by a massive economic engine, trading inland cotton for the endless bounty of the sea. Eventually, shifting climates and droughts forced the people of Caral to walk away. They left behind no written texts, only the mysterious quipu, a system of knotted strings blowing in the desert wind, holding data we still cannot read. They surrendered their cities peacefully to the dust. Caral was abandoned to time. But deep in prehistoric Europe, a very different kind of society chose a much more violent end. They didn't simply walk away from their homes, they set them on fire. The Liangzhu Civilization. Wind strips the landscape bare. There was nothing here but heat, dust, and shifting dunes. Then, the ground changes. Beneath the sand, a sprawling geometric grid emerges. Massive concentric walls, fortified gates, the scorched foundations of a forgotten world. Before the Silk Road was ever walked, a forgotten civilization built an empire of fortified cities across the harshest deserts of Central Asia, and then vanished without leaving its own name. Welcome to the Oxus Civilization. To archaeologists, it is known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. 4,500 years ago, long before the empires of Greece or Rome, this was a sprawling network of heavily guarded maze-like oases. Imagine a caravan surviving a brutal, weeks-long desert crossing. Emerging from the blinding heat, a traveler would have seen the citadel of Göbekli Tepe rising like a mirage. A towering fortress, ringed by defensive walls, bursting with water, firelight, and unimaginable wealth. Inside these walls, excavators have uncovered objects that feel completely disconnected from the familiar ancient world. Intricate bronze axes, masterpieces cast in silver and gold, and most haunting of all, a series of stone statues known today as the Bactrian princesses. They are heavy, seated figures carved from dark chlorite and white limestone. Their bodies are enveloped in thick, stylized garments, but their faces are entirely blank, featureless, unreadable. To look at a Bactrian princess is to look at a ghost holding court in the sand. For centuries, this culture was completely missing from the history books. But when modern archaeologists began mapping the artifacts, a massive web of influence lit up in the dark. The Oxus was a commercial superpower. They pumped lapis lazuli, tin, and copper across the ancient world. They traded with the monumental builders of Mesopotamia. They exchanged goods with the sprawling cities of the Indus Valley. Whether they were ruled by a single warlord or operated as a ruthless confederacy of oasis kings, their economic reach was imperial. But here, the story hits an absolute, terrifying wall of silence. The Oxus traded with highly literate societies. They handled foreign goods stamped with foreign texts. Yet among the millions of artifacts pulled from their ruins, no one has ever found a single confirmed sentence of their own writing. No king lists, no laws recorded in clay, no names carved into stone. We do not know the names of the monarchs who built these towering walls. We do not know what they called their faceless gods. We do not even know what they called themselves. Around 1700 BCE, the network simply broke. Rivers shifted, climates changed, trade routes collapsed. The great fortresses were emptied out, and the desert quietly swallowed the walls. The Oxus Civilization proves a haunting truth about history. A society can shape the world, command immense wealth, and build towering monuments, and still lose its identity to time. Physical power does not require a name to leave a scar on the earth. The Oxus left their cities to the dry, shifting sand. But thousands of miles to the east, another civilization was mastering a very different element. A kingdom defined not by the desert, but by the overwhelming, unstoppable force of water. The Oxus Civilization. 5,000 years ago, Liangzhu controlled rivers, built a sprawling capital, and buried its rulers under mountains of jade. Yet today, not a single king's name survives. In the flooded marshlands of the lower Yangtze River, a completely different kind of power was rising. This was not an empire of stone. It was an empire of mud, wood, and water. Long before the first recorded dynasties of China, the people of Liangzhu achieved something staggering. To protect their capital and irrigate their crops, they engineered a sprawling network of dams, levees, and canals. They moved more earth than the builders of the early Egyptian pyramids, forcing the wild waters of the delta to obey their command. But their physical mastery of water was only half the story. Their true authority came from something much colder and much stranger: jade. In Liangzhu culture, jade was not simply decorative jewelry. It was an ancient technology. It was the absolute, unyielding mechanism used to bind the physical world to the divine. The rulers of Liangzhu were buried with heavy jade tubes called chong, representing the earth, and circular discs called bi, representing heaven. Carved into these stones with microscopic, impossible precision is a recurring, almost alien image. A terrifying man-beast deity with enormous staring eyes, a feathered headdress, and bared fangs. It looks less like a human portrait and more like a guardian from a nightmare. When archaeologists open the highest status tombs, they do not find kings holding weapons of war. They find skeletons almost completely suffocated by hundreds of these heavy jade artifacts. It is the footprint of a ruthlessly stratified, theocratic society, a world where the elite held absolute power over life, death, and the gods. But like the Oxus, they left no writing behind. The rulers who wore the terrifying masks and commanded armies of laborers took their identities to the grave. And then, the heavens turned against them. When researchers took core samples from the ruins of Liangzhu, they found a definitive, tragic marker: a thick, suffocating layer of yellow clay blanketing the entire ancient city. Around 2300 BCE, a catastrophic climate shift triggered a period of massive, unstoppable flooding. The rivers swelled, the great earthen dams finally broke, the levees failed. The empire of water was drowned by the very element it had tried to control. They had engineered the earth. They had locked the heavens in jade. But the water took everything back. Liangzhu was erased by a flooded delta. But on the exact opposite side of the planet, another civilization was already rising. They lived on the edge of a bone-dry desert, and they were building something that history says shouldn't be there at all.